Before we dive into the greatest political experiment in human history, let's talk about something unexpected: a corporate bailout, a French conspiracy, and a group of incredibly wealthy men who decided that dying was somehow better than paying their taxes. The story of America's birth isn't the clean, heroic narrative you'll find in most textbooks. It's a messy, complicated tale of corporate greed, elite self-interest, accidental gunfire, miraculous weather, and a French king who funded American freedom, and then lost his head because of it. Let's journey back to the real beginning. Long before any European explorer set foot on these shores, long before the idea of America even existed, this land was already home to millions of people living in sophisticated, thriving civilizations. Picture this: between 900 and 1200 CE, near what we now call St. Louis, there stood a city called Cahokia. At its peak, this urban center had a larger population than London. Yes, you heard that right, larger than London. Cahokia featured massive earthen pyramids that rose high above the Mississippi River Valley. Its urban planning was remarkably complex, with neighborhoods, plazas, and astronomical alignments that rivaled anything being built in Europe during the same period. Even older was Poverty Point in Louisiana, dating back to approximately 1700 BCE. Think about that for a moment. This civilization predated the Roman Empire by more than 1,000 years. These weren't primitive settlements, these were engineered communities. Connecting these civilizations was something called the Hopewell Interaction Sphere, a vast trade network operating between 100 BCE and 500 CE. This network stretched from the Rocky Mountains all the way to the Atlantic coast. From the Great Lakes, obsidian from Yellowstone, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, all of these materials were traded across thousands of miles with remarkable organizational sophistication. This wasn't random trading, this was an economic system. Then there was the Haudenosaunee, known today as the Iroquois Confederacy. This political alliance united 5 nations, later 6, under a constitutional framework of governance. And here's the remarkable part: this happened centuries before anyone in Philadelphia put pen to parchment. Benjamin Franklin himself explicitly cited the Iroquois model at the Albany Congress of 1754 as a template for how the colonies might cooperate. The Founding Fathers didn't invent democracy from scratch. They had examples right in front of them, so this wasn't a wilderness waiting to be discovered. This was a fully functioning world with trade routes, political systems, architecture, and governance. Europeans chose to pretend it didn't exist because pretending made stealing it considerably easier. Now let's talk about Christopher Columbus. Here's the uncomfortable truth: Columbus did not discover America, the Vikings did. Specifically, a Norse explorer named Leif Erikson landed in Newfoundland around the year 1000 CE. There's a place in Newfoundland called L'Anse aux Meadows where you can still visit the archaeological remains of this Viking settlement. Erikson beat Columbus to North America by roughly 500 years. That's half a millennium. What Columbus actually accomplished in October of 1492 was triggering a corporate-sponsored land grab. He was funded by Spanish Crown interests seeking a new trade route to Asia that would bypass the Ottoman-controlled land routes. Columbus landed in the Caribbean, never actually set foot in North America, and died still believing he had reached Asia. He wasn't a visionary explorer, he was a navigator who got lost and stumbled onto something he didn't understand. What followed was something historians call the Columbian Exchange, one of the most consequential ecological events in all of human history. It fundamentally transformed both the Old World and the New World in ways that still shape our lives today. Tobacco, corn, potatoes, tomatoes, and chocolate flowed eastward to Europe, revolutionizing European cuisine and agriculture. Imagine Italian food without tomatoes or Irish culture without potatoes. These foods didn't exist in Europe before Columbus. Horses, cattle, wheat, and European diseases flowed westward to the Americas. Of these, it was the diseases that would prove most catastrophic. Smallpox, measles, and typhus swept through indigenous populations with devastating speed. Historians estimate that between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population died from European diseases within the first century of contact. Let that sink in. Up to 90%. This was the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. This mass depopulation is precisely why later European colonists could claim the land appeared empty. They had already, whether intentionally or not, emptied it. The wilderness they saw was actually a post-apocalyptic landscape. Columbus didn't discover a new world. He opened a door that unleashed demographic collapse, ecological transformation, and centuries of exploitation. And then, in a very real sense, he charged admission for others to follow. Fast forward to the 1700s. The 13 colonies were never intended to be a home, a place where people built lives and communities. They were intended to be a profit engine for the British Empire. The economic system was called mercantilism, and here's how it worked. The more gold and silver your country controls, the more powerful it is. So the goal of every empire is to export as much as possible and import as little as possible. And colonies were just factories you didn't have to pay for. They existed to enrich the mother country. The people living in them were simply tools in a larger economic machine. Britain enforced this system through a series of laws called the Navigation Acts, passed between 1651 and 1673. These laws controlled virtually every aspect of colonial economic life. The colonies were forced to trade exclusively with Britain, ship all goods only on British vessels, and pay duties and tariffs on nearly everything. They produced raw materials like tobacco, timber, cotton, and furs, which were shipped to Britain. These raw materials were then manufactured into finished goods in Britain and sold back to the colonists at a significant profit. To make matters worse, colonists were legally prohibited from manufacturing many goods themselves. The resentment this system generated was enormous and grew with each passing year. Colonial merchants were systematically undercut at every turn, prevented from competing, and forced to pay inflated prices for basic necessities. Many responded by becoming expert smugglers. John Hancock, yes, the man with the most famous signature in American history, the largest signature on the Declaration of Independence, was one of the most successful smugglers in all of Massachusetts. The British Crown was hemorrhaging enormous sums to colonial black markets. Entire fortunes were built on avoiding British taxes and trading with the French, Dutch, and Spanish. Smuggling wasn't a crime. It was a patriotic act. The American Revolution wasn't really a philosophical debate about liberty and natural rights, at least not at first. It was a trade war. And the British started it by trying to enforce a system that no longer worked. The war that made American independence inevitable wasn't the Revolutionary War itself. It was a global conflict called the 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763. Known in America as the French and Indian War, this was actually the world's first truly global conflict. Battles were fought across North America, Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, India, and the Philippines. Britain won decisively. France surrendered all its North American territory east of the Mississippi River. Spain surrendered Florida. On paper, Britain had become the world's dominant superpower, but Britain's victory came at a catastrophic financial cost. Britain emerged from the war with a national debt of £130 million, equivalent to tens of billions of dollars in today's money. The annual interest payments alone were crippling the British economy. Something had to be done, and quickly. The British government's reasoning was, on the surface at least, fairly logical. They had spent enormous sums protecting the colonies from French expansion, defending the frontier, and securing colonial trade. The colonies had directly benefited from this military protection. Therefore, the colonies should help repay that cost. The colonists had a direct and powerful counter-argument. We have no representatives in the parliament that is taxing us. How can you tax us when we have no voice, no vote, no representation? This argument distilled into the phrase "no taxation without representation" would define the next decade of increasingly bitter conflict. It became the rallying cry that united the colonies like nothing before. Every tax act Britain introduced between 1764 and 1773 was a political miscalculation that deepened colonial unity and intensified resistance. Each one made reconciliation less likely. The Sugar Act of 1764 taxed imported sugar and molasses, hitting New England merchants and rum distillers the hardest. It was the first major revenue act specifically targeting the colonies rather than regulating trade. Then came the Stamp Act of 1765, which taxed virtually every piece of paper in the colonies. Legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, licenses, even playing cards. This was different from anything that had come before. The Stamp Act didn't just tax imported trade goods that colonists could choose to avoid. It taxed everyday colonial life itself. There was no way to avoid it. Everyone was affected, from the wealthiest merchant to the poorest farmer. The response was explosive and immediate. Samuel Adams organized a resistance group called the Sons of Liberty. Stamp tax collectors were intimidated, threatened, and in some cases tarred and feathered. British goods were boycotted so effectively that British merchants themselves, watching their profits collapse, lobbied Parliament for repeal. The economic pressure was intense and undeniable. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, but here's the catch. Parliament simultaneously passed something called the Declaratory Act, asserting its absolute right to tax the colonies in any manner it chose. Then came the Townshend Acts of 1767, imposing new duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. The colonists organized boycotts again. Most of these taxes were eventually repealed except for one. The tax on tea remained. It was kept deliberately, symbolically, as a demonstration that Parliament retained the right to tax the colonies. That one symbolic tax would prove to be a catastrophic mistake. In response to colonial resistance, Britain sent 4,000 soldiers to occupy Boston, a city of only 16,000 people. Think about that ratio, one soldier for every 4 civilians. Boston became an occupied city. On March 5, 1770, the simmering tension finally exploded. A crowd of colonists confronted British soldiers outside the customs house on a cold winter night. Insults were shouted, snowballs and rocks were thrown. The soldiers panicked and fired into the crowd. 5 colonists were killed, including a man named Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and Native American descent. He's widely considered the first martyr of the American Revolution. Paul Revere, the silversmith who would later become famous for his midnight ride, produced an engraving depicting the scene. It showed British soldiers firing in an organized volley on a peaceful, unarmed crowd. The engraving was deliberately misleading, designed to inflame public opinion. It was propaganda, pure and simple, and it worked with devastating effectiveness, spreading throughout the colonies and turning public opinion sharply against Britain. On December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty, disguised as Mohawk warriors, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor under cover of darkness. They systematically destroyed 342 chests of tea worth approximately 10,000 pounds, roughly $1.7 million in today's money. They were methodical and careful. No ships were damaged, no sailors were hurt, nothing else was stolen or destroyed. This wasn't a chaotic riot. It was a precisely targeted political act designed to send a very specific message. But the reason behind the Tea Party is far more complex than most history classes explain. The British East India Company was the world's first mega corporation. It had its own army and governed vast territories in India. By the early 1770s, the company was on the verge of bankruptcy. with 18 million pounds of unsold tea sitting in British warehouses. This was a genuine financial crisis. The British government's solution was the Tea Act of 1773, essentially a corporate bailout. The East India Company could now ship tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants entirely. Even with the tax included, East India Company tea was cheaper than what colonial merchants could offer. It would have destroyed the colonial tea trade overnight, creating a complete monopoly. So, the Boston Tea Party wasn't really a protest against taxation. It was a protest against a corporate bailout designed to make a monopoly so cheap that no American business could possibly compete with it. Britain's response to the Tea Party was severe, systematic, and strategically catastrophic. The Coercive Acts of 1774, which colonists immediately renamed the Intolerable Acts, consisted of 5 brutal measures. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor entirely until the destroyed tea was paid for. No ships in, no ships out. The economic lifeblood of the city was cut off completely. The Massachusetts Government Act dissolved the colonial assembly and imposed direct crown rule. Self-government, which colonists had enjoyed for generations, was simply erased by parliamentary decree. The Administration of Justice Act allowed British officials accused of crimes to be tried in Britain rather than in the colonies. Colonists called it the Murder Act because it meant British soldiers could kill colonists without facing local justice. The Quartering Act forced colonists to house and feed British soldiers in their own homes. Imagine armed soldiers of an occupying force living in your house, eating your food, and you're paying for it. The Quebec Act extended Quebec's territory south into the Ohio Valley, blocking colonial westward expansion. Land speculators, including George Washington, watched their investments vanish overnight. Britain intended to isolate Massachusetts and make an example of it, terrifying the other colonies into submission. Instead, the opposite happened. The other colonies rallied immediately to Massachusetts' defense. An attack on one is an attack on all became the unifying colonial sentiment. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia in September 1774, bringing together delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. The men who would eventually sign the Declaration of Independence were not ordinary citizens representing common farmers and workers. They were the colonial 1%, the wealthiest and most powerful men in America. George Washington was the largest landowner in Virginia, controlling thousands of acres. John Hancock was the wealthiest merchant in New England, with a fortune built partly on smuggling. Benjamin Franklin was an internationally celebrated diplomat, scientist, and celebrity. Thomas Jefferson was a plantation owner who would go on to own more than 600 enslaved human beings during his lifetime. Jefferson was the same man who wrote the immortal words, "All men are created equal." That profound contradiction between stated ideals and lived reality would take 89 more years and a devastating civil war to begin to address. Under British law, the penalty for treason was hanging, drawing, and quartering, among the most brutal execution methods in legal history. Every delegate who signed the Declaration of Independence was effectively signing a potential death warrant. King George explicitly stated he wanted the rebel leaders captured and hanged publicly as a warning to anyone else who might consider rebellion. This wasn't abstract political theory, this was life or death. These men weren't heroes in a movie, they were complicated, deeply flawed, extraordinarily wealthy elites who decided that dying free was somehow better than living taxed, and that imperfect decision changed the world forever.